So let's start this evening's session. So again, this is the fourth session of this shamatha practice program, focusing on the mindfulness of breathing. And so again, let's begin by first setting a motivation. So just a few moments, setting motivation in your own way. So let's see what we've got. I'll just share the screen here. Okay. So let's see what we're going to cover in this evening's session. So this is session 4, looking at the mindfulness of breathing practice, focusing in the area of the abdomen. We'll begin as normal with a review of some of the main points from the earlier sessions. Then we'll continue the mindfulness of breathing, the full body practice that we've been doing in the last session or two. But this time we'll do a slight variation of that, and that is to focus on the rhythm of the breath. That's useful for a number of reasons, and I'll talk about that shortly. And then we'll be looking at the stages of progress in the practice. So we'll be using this diagram here, and also the other charts that you've got. So if you've got those printed, keep them handy so they'll be useful. Then we'll look at this evening's actual practice, which is the mindfulness of breathing practice, focusing in the area of the abdomen. So some discussion about that practice, and then another guided meditation on that. And as normal, we'll finish with some Q&A. So this is the 4th session. So this is the first of 2 sessions on the abdomen. Then we'll have 2 sessions on the nostrils, and then integrating into daily life. The recommended reading for this program is The Attention Revolution from Alan Wallace. And if you want to go into a little bit more technical detail, then the volume 3 of this Lamrim Chenmo, the great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment by Tsongkhapa, has a lot of in-depth descriptions of various elements that we're going through in this program. So in this shamatha training, we'll be looking at the prerequisites for shamatha training. Prerequisites is all about sort of how to set up our life in such a way to support this practice, and we'll be looking at that in session 7. In terms of the actual meditation practice, in the first session we looked at preparation in terms of preparing body, speech, and mind. That we saw there that it's very important to prepare ourselves well in any meditation session. Preparing body, of course, was all about setting up a good posture. So we want to be able to put the body in a state so that we can basically forget about the body, so that it doesn't create any interference in our meditative practice. Preparing speech, simply allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. And by allowing the breathing to calm down, the mind itself calms down. There's a very close relationship between the breath and the mind. And so that segues then into preparing the mind, which is really about bringing the mind into the present moment, particularly getting out of the future, particularly with meditation. Often at the beginning of a meditation, we're already in the future in terms of having some sort of expectations for the meditation, or worrying about what may or may not happen in the upcoming session. So to let go of all of these things and simply allow the mind to come to rest in the present moment, and very clear mind. And so from that basis, then we can effectively begin the actual meditation. And so for this shamatha meditation, we looked at 4 topics already. Firstly, in session 2, what qualities are we cultivating in this practice? And we saw there that in the older original meditation texts on shamatha, 2 qualities were mentioned, stability and clarity, to to cultivate a stable mind to help overcome distraction, and to be able to focus in a very clear way to overcome any sort of dullness or laxity. But here we added a third quality that often you won't really see much mention of in the original meditation texts, and that is the quality of relaxation. And that's something I think that most of us, if not all of us, have to really pay close attention to for us in the modern world. Because we tend to come into meditation practice with very hectic lifestyles, a lot of agitation and stress, chaotic mind. And we tend to, as our habit in daily life, whenever we want to focus on anything, any activity or object in our life, we tend to tense a lot. And so we tend to bring this into meditation practice. And I think one of the main reasons that we have a lot of difficulties as a beginner in meditation practice is we're simply too tight, we're too tense, we're simply trying too hard. So very first thing we need to do in this and any meditation practice is we need to learn how to relax. And as I mentioned a number of times already, I can't overemphasize this point enough from my own experience in talking to many people, that if we want to cultivate any sort of sustainable stability and clarity, we really need to have an effective basis of relaxation. So really a relaxed body and mind. And then in terms of objects, for this shamatha practice, the general recommendation is, of course, to use the object that works best for you. And in the shamatha texts, such as the Lamrim Chenmo that we've been looking at a little bit, a lot of different objects or possibilities are mentioned, but probably the one that's most widely emphasized in many Buddhist traditions is the breath. And we saw there that many of the great past masters really highly recommended the breath for those of us who have highly discursive minds. And that, I think, accounts for most of us in the modern world. We tend to be very discursive minds, a lot of thinking constantly, in fact, often obsessive compulsive thinking. And so therefore the breath is very good for us who have very discursive minds, because it helps us to get out of that into the body and get out of the past and future into the present moment. And so that's the variation, the object that we're working on in this program, of course. And in this program, we're looking at 3 variations of that breath practice: the full body breath practice that we've already covered. And that's really to focus on the sensations of breath anywhere in the body. And that's particularly conducive for cultivating relaxation. And then the one we're going to begin in this session a little bit later is to focus on the area of the abdomen. So this is particularly conducive for improving stability of attention. And then in a couple of sessions' time, we'll be looking at focusing at the entrance of the nostrils. And this is particularly conducive for improving clarity of attention. But then we saw that in Attention Evolution from Alan Wallace, he also recommended 2 other objects that he recommended to begin with the breath, to work with that for some time. In fact, I think he said to work with that until we get to about stage 4 of the shamatha path, and we'll be looking at these stages this evening. And then we can switch to observing the mind, that is to observe our mind and any thoughts that come up in the mind. And then at the high levels of the shamatha practice, path to shamatha, to shift to resting in awareness. Now, both the mind and awareness practice, many people find very challenging, particularly the mind practice, because we're not used to observing our thoughts. And so therefore, many people find it very challenging, much more challenging than breath. But as we've already briefly seen, enormous benefits for using the mind as the object can really help us to become the masters of our own mind instead of being the slaves of our own mind, which unfortunately many of us in the modern world tend to be, often overwhelmed and tormented by our thoughts and emotions and memories and so forth. So this practice can really help us to become the masters of our mind. And then we also saw that in the Lamrim Chenmo from Tsongkhapa, that he recommended in particular to use the mental image of a Buddha as the object for shamatha practice. Again, many good reasons for that. But many of you who've tried to use that probably found that very challenging because it's a very complex visualization, and we don't tend to be very good at visualizing and don't really have a good appreciation of what it looks like. So many people find that very challenging. So hence we're using the breath as the object in this program. And so then that brings us to have a look at the 2 topics from the last session. So I'd like to review them in a little bit more detail now. And that is, what tools do we use in this practice of shamatha? What faults could arise and how do we overcome them? And then as we see, we're going to start to look at the stages of progress in this practice a little bit later in this session. So remember, we saw that in terms of tools, we had this quote here, the out of control elephant of the mind. So what we find in this practice, that the mind is often symbolized by an elephant, a chaotic mind. The out of control elephant of the mind is to be bound to the firm post of the observed object using the rope of mindfulness and gradually brought under the control by the hook of introspection. And so we see this in the shamatha diagram here, which we'll be looking at in more detail a little bit later. The meditator there beginning the shamatha practice in their left hand is a rope that is symbolizing mindfulness, and the right hand is a hook, that's the hook symbolizing introspection. So these are the 2 main tools we use. And we saw there that mindfulness is defined as the faculty of sustaining voluntary attention continuously upon a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. So really, mindfulness is simply our ability to hold the object, to not get distracted, to not forget the object. But then together with mindfulness, we need that second tool, the tool of introspection, which is really quality control, to monitor the mindfulness. How are we going? Are we still focusing on the object, or are we starting to get dull or distracted? So here, introspection in general is simply monitoring both the body and the mind, but in particular in shamatha practice, the main function is to notice if there's any dullness or distraction, or technical terms, of course, are any laxity or excitation are arising. And there we saw also in the last session that mindfulness now, of course, has become very popular in the modern world, even somewhat trendy. And in a lot of the modern day mindfulness traditions, what we find is that mindfulness has really been redefined to mean something slightly different. And it's often in modern traditions defined as something like a non-judgmental awareness of whatever is arising in the present moment. Again, a good thing to do, but this is not really how the word mindfulness was originally defined. So we need to be aware of this difference of the usage of mindfulness. Otherwise, we can get a little bit confused. So here, of course, mindfulness, the faculty of sustaining voluntary attention continuously upon a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. So they were the tools. And then in terms of the faults, we saw there that there were 5 main faults that can arise in this training. And then we have 8 antidotes to overcome those faults. The first fault was the fault of laziness. And we saw there we needed really 4 antidotes for laziness. The first of those is faith. So to really overcome laziness, we need to develop faith in the practice. And here we had that quote from, again, Lamrim Chemo from Tsongkhapa. He says, if you cannot stop the laziness of being disinclined to cultivate concentration and of enjoying things that are not conducive to it, from the outset, you will not gain entry into concentration. So again, if we don't really appreciate the benefits of this practice, then of course we're going to be very lazy when it comes to doing it. So really to reflect on the benefits of the practice, and then we'll have a lot of faith in the practice that it's going to really benefit us. The more faith we have in the practice, of course, the more we'll aspire to do the practice. The more we aspire to do the practice, the more enthusiasm and effort we'll put into practice. And the more effort we put into practice, the more we'll have this physical and mental pliancy, this flexibility and serviceability of body and mind. which I'll talk more about in next session. And then the second fault was the fault of forgetfulness. And so this can mean either forgetting the object or forgetting the instructions. And so the antidote is mindfulness, to remember the instructions, to remember the object. And then we had that twin pair of laxity and excitation. And the antidote was introspection, quality control, to notice when laxity or excitation are arising. The fourth fault was non-application. And remember, non-application here was that we've noticed that we've become dull or distracted, or some laxity or excitation has arisen, and we don't do anything about it. That's a fault. And so the antidote is application, which means do something. And we'll look at what to do again very shortly. But then we had the fifth fault called over-application. And that's not really a problem for us as beginners, but when we get to the quite high levels of shamatha, and we really start to overcome even very subtle levels of laxity and excitation, then continuing to put effort in terms of monitoring for that and correcting that when we don't need to is a fault. And so the antidote to that is equanimity, means that the mind is already balanced, free of laxity, excitation, so just leave it as it is. So saying is, of course, if it's not broken, don't fix it. So let's have a look a little bit more again at laxity and excitation. So remember, what is excitation? An excitation is the most common form of distraction, and hence it's listed here rather than distraction. It is an unquiet state of mind considered to be a derivative of attachment, which pursues pleasant objects and acts as an impediment to shamatha. So therefore, how do we overcome, how do we remedy if our mind is getting this excitation, agitation, and starts to get distracted? Then the first thing to do is relax, to relax the body and mind, because with this excitation, we're already starting to get tense. And we also, when we get distracted, we tend to get frustrated and clamp down. So to avoid that habit, first thing to do when we notice any excitation or distraction arising, relax body and mind. And then release the distraction and very gently return to the object. So relax, release, return. Then what to do if we have strong excitation, if it's coming a lot more strongly. And so here Shanti Deva is saying that if that happens, to calm it by bringing impermanence to mind, meaning that if we are getting caught up in these pleasurable distractions, then to bring impermanence to mind, to come to see that these things are transient and they're never going to fulfill us and satisfy us, to let go of any craving and attachment to them so that we can bring the mind back, to bring the mind down and to the object. And if we have very strong excitation, then in Lamrim Chenmo, Tsongkhapa recommends, he says, if you have very strong or prolonged excitation arises, it is crucial that you relax the meditation for a while and cultivate a sense of disenchantment, rather than attempting to pull in your mind and direct it back to the object of meditation every time it becomes scattered. So if we're just constantly distracted and for a long period of time, then we need a sort of a backup strategy. And that is to stop the meditation and cultivate this sense of disenchantment with the things that we're chasing after of and we're getting distracted to. And I'll talk a little bit about more about that shortly. In fact, I'll talk about it now. So here we've seen if excitation arises, calm it by bringing impermanence to the mind. So this is all from Lamrim Chenmo. If very strong or prolonged excitation arises, cultivate a sense of disenchantment. And then also from last session, he said, here is the most important remedy for stopping laxity. When you reflect on the benefits of bodhicitta and the great significance of attaining leisure, it should have a bracing effect on your mind. This depends on your having had experience with discerning analytical meditation on these beneficial topics. So what we see here is that for both laxity and excitation, or dullness and distraction, a lot of this is due to the fact of not having done the foundation practices, what's often called the common preliminaries. In some traditions, it's called the 4 thoughts that turn the mind. So so we need to really reflect on things like precious human life, that we have a life of opportunity and not to waste it, to reflect on death and impermanence, to reflect on actions and their results in terms of this law of causality, in terms of karma, and to reflect on the unsatisfactory nature of samsara. This is what we mean here by disenchantment. By doing these common preliminaries, these foundation practices, and those of you who, of course, have studied the Lam Rim, they're not really packaged as the common preliminaries, but these are some of the very first meditations to reflect on in the Lam Rim system of practice. So these precede, of course, shamatha practice, which comes sort of later in the Lam Rim sequence and comes later in all these various systems of practice. Because if we don't put effort into these preliminary practices, then of course we're still going to be chasing after sense pleasures and wasting our life and so forth. And then it's going to be very difficult to do this shamatha practice. So that's why Tsongkhapa says this depends on having had experience with discerning analytical meditation on these beneficial topics. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in a later session as well, in terms of framework for shamatha practice. And then laxity. So remember, laxity, technical word for dullness. It says laxity means that your mind's way of apprehending the object of meditation is slack, and it does not apprehend the object with much vividness or firmness. So how to remedy laxity or dullness when it arises? First, refresh your interest in the practice, restore your attention on the object to sharpen your focus, that is, and then to hold that object, to retain that flow of mindfulness. So refresh, restore, retain. And then if we have strong laxity, again, Shantideva is saying, if your mind becomes slack, inspire yourself by cultivating delight. Again, reflecting on precious human life and bodhicitta and so forth, uplift the mind. And then if we have very strong laxity, what to do? If laxity is dense and seems to occur repeatedly, suspend your cultivation of concentration, clear away laxity, and then resume your meditation. In this regard, a Sangha suggests such activities as going for a walk and washing your face with water. So again, we see these 3 levels of what to do in terms of laxity and excitation. First line, what to do if it arises. Second line, if it's strong. And if it's very strong, what to do in both cases. So if it's very strong in both cases, then we need to break the meditation and then come back to a good state by doing these sorts of reflections or going for a walk and so forth, come back to the meditation. So let's now go to the meditation. Again, we'll continue this practice we did last session, the full body breath practice. But here we're going to do a slight variation of that practice. So the earlier practice was just simply noticing any sensations in the body correlated with the breathing. So we're going to continue to do that here, but this time, based on that, we're going to notice the rhythm of our breath. Is to simply notice if our breath is long or short, deep or shallow, slow or fast. Just simply noticing the rhythm of our breath. So this also is very conducive for relaxation. And again, in this practice, simply allow the breathing to flow naturally. So we're not trying to control the breath. We're not trying to make it rhythmic or shallow or whatever. Let the breathing do whatever it wants. We're simply noticing the rhythm of the breath. What is the breath doing? And of course, that'll probably change. Sometimes you might notice it's fast and then it becomes slow, it becomes fast again, but that's okay. We're just noticing the rhythm of the breath. And again, emphasizing relaxation, particularly on the out breath, just releasing any tension, releasing any thoughts on the out breath. And again, if you find that you have a lot of tension, you can use the Shavasana posture for this meditation where we're emphasizing relaxation. Remember, we're emphasizing relaxation, but not allowing ourselves to sink into dullness or laxity. So maintain whatever level of clarity you begin with. And this practice of focusing on the rhythm of the breath is very helpful as an anchor for other practices and also as an anchor for daily life. So it's very good practice to become competent at. So let's do that practice now. 15-minute practice. So if you'd like to find a nice comfortable posture, let's begin. We begin as always by preparing the body. So establishing a nice comfortable posture. Keeping the back nice and straight. And at the same time, allow the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Not trying to control or regulate the breath in any way. Simply allowing it to flow naturally and effortlessly. And with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Resting in that stillness. Now, from that stillness, start to become aware of the rhythm of your breath. Noticing if it's long or short, deep or shallow, slow or fast. Without trying to regulate the breath in any way. Simply maintaining an ongoing flow of mindfulness of the rhythm of the breath. If you get distracted from the breath, remember the first thing to do is simply relax. Then release the distraction and very gently return to focusing on the rhythm of the breath. So relax, release, and return. Simply keep coming back to the breath again and again, patiently and happily. And so in this practice, the emphasis is on relaxation. So using the out breath as an opportunity to relax and release any tightness or tension, and to release any thoughts in the mind. And if you find yourself falling or sinking into dullness or drowsiness, then use the in-breath as an opportunity to arouse and refresh your focus, to sharpen your focus on the breath. And so we can bring the meditation to a close. So we'll now look at, or begin to look at, the stages of progress in the shamatha practice. Now, there are a number of different models that are used in describing the stages of progress in this practice. The one we'll be looking at now is really the classic model that is used particularly when using such an object such as the breath. And so that's what we see here in the color diagram on the left side there, this sort of windy road to shamatha, this 9-stage model. And then we have a chart describing some of the features of each of those stages. But actually in the chart, as we're going to see in the next slide, there's sort of 2 models that are sort of being put together in the one chart there. And then also on the right-hand side, we see also a black and white version of the diagram, particularly with some translations of the descriptions that we see in the color diagram. So we'll be referring to those as well. So if you have those 3 things printed out, that's good. If not, we've got some of them on the slides here. So let's begin. So first, and here's a quote, I think, from Panchen Losang Chögyal Gyaltsen again, from his shamatha section of his Mahamudra text. He says, shamatha is attained by progressing through the 9 stages, relying on the 8 antidotes to abandon the 5 faults. So we looked at the 8 antidotes and 5 faults already. This is accomplished through the 6 powers and the 4 mental engagements. So here we have the names of these 9 stages that we're going to be looking at, from directed attention all the way up to attentional balance. The 6 powers here are the power by which we move to the main power by which we move to the next stage of the path. And they represent the sort of really the bendy part of the path here to get onto the next level of the shamatha practice. And we'll look at those. And the 4 mental engagements is how are we engaging on the object? And so we'll be discussing those as well. Different way of engaging in the object as we progress along these 9 stages. Now, this word, remember this word shamatha is a Sanskrit word, which we can divide into 2 parts, shama and ta. And here in this, the diagram, the chart here rather, there are actually 2 models that are sort of put together. The one we're looking at, the classic presentation, is a 9-stage model. But also we find that when we use the object of shamatha, such as observing the mind, for example, then in describing the stages of progress in shamatha using the mind as the object, we often don't see this 9-stage model. More common is a 4-stage model that we see here. And the difference being is really the perspective we have in both of those shamatha practices, the breath versus the mind. So in the breath practice, the perspective is the mind perspective, meaning the mind abiding better and better on the object. And so these 9 stages are actually called the 9 mental abidings, our mind abiding better and better on the object. Whereas when we use the mind as the object for shamatha practice, i.e. observing our thoughts, the perspective we have really is much more the event perspective. How are the events unfolding in the mind? And so here we have more classically this 4-stage model. So because originally when we use the mind as the object, our mind is full of thoughts. And so it's like a cascading waterfall of thoughts. And then if we continue to observe those thoughts in the mind, they start to settle down a little bit. So the next stage of progress is we'll notice, instead of a cascade of a waterfall of thoughts, it'll be more like a fast flowing river of thoughts. And if we keep watching those thoughts, they'll slow down even more. And the next stage, it'll be more like a slow moving river of thoughts. And then eventually at the high levels of practice, that our mind will become completely still. So it'll be like the river emptying into a still lake or an ocean. So this is the typical model that's used when we use the mind as the object. And we see in this chart here, they're sort of put together, correlated. And we'll have a look at the correlations as we go through the chart. So let's begin by looking at the first. So we're looking at the color diagram, although I've printed out here in black and white. And we see down the bottom, remember, we have the meditator there. And we saw already that in the meditator's left hand is the rope of mindfulness, and in their right hand is the hook of introspection. So these are the two main tools we use. And we already saw the symbolism that the elephant is the mind, and the fact that it is black is symbolizing dullness or laxity. The monkey is conceptual or discursive thought in general, and the fact that it is black is symbolizing this excitement or excitation, the most common form of distraction. And then also we see here on the side of the path a flame, a big flame, and there's a lot of writing underneath there. And so if we go to the black and white diagram, the second page, there's a translation of that there. And what it says about the big flame down the bottom, it says, from here until the seventh stage, the flame progressively decreases in size until it becomes absent. This difference denotes the measure of the strength of effort required regarding mindfulness and introspection. So now, of course, as a beginning stage, our mindfulness and introspection are not very well developed. So we need to put a lot of effort in terms of our mindfulness and introspection. So hence the flame is very large. But if you have the diagram there, you'll see as we wind up the road to shamatha, this flame gets progressively smaller and smaller. And then towards the high levels of the 9 stages, it completely disappears, meaning that our mindfulness and introspection at the high levels are so well developed, then it really just becomes effortless in terms of our focusing on the object. So let's have a look at this first stage. Stage 1, it's called directed attention. So what we achieve at the first stage is we're simply able to direct the attention to our object, even for a second or two. So if we can focus on our object even for a second or two, we've achieved the first stage. Of course, if our object is a complex visualization, such as a mental image of a Buddha, it may take some time for us to achieve this first stage because it's a complex object. But if we're focusing on the breath, we may achieve this first stage on the very first time we meditate on the breath. Simply being able to hold the object for a couple of seconds. And the power with which we achieve that first stage is the power of hearing, or here it's called learning the instructions. So to get to the first stage, of course, we need to hear about the shamatha practice. We need to know what it is, how to do it, what to do in the practice. And then by applying those instructions, we can achieve the first stage. What problems persist at the first stage is there's no attentional continuity on the object, meaning that we can only hold the object for a few seconds at a time, and we get distracted very easily, and we tend to be distracted for long periods of time. So therefore, the main imbalance here is coarse excitation. So remember, coarse excitation is where we get completely distracted from the object. Now, what happens here in the first stages of this program, in this practice, of course, is we sit down, we meditate on the breath, we do that for 2 or 3 seconds, and then we get distracted. Off we go on our story. And it's usually only some minutes later we go, oh, hang on, I'm supposed to be focusing on the breath. We come back to the breath for another 2 or 3 seconds, and then off we go again on another story. And so when that happens, then often we go, I can't meditate. I just can't meditate. In fact, I think I must be doing something wrong, because since I started meditating, my mind has got worse. Before it used to be okay, a little sort of okay. Now it's gone completely crazy. So I definitely can't meditate, and I'm definitely doing something wrong. I'm hopeless. So if that is your experience, very good. It means you actually can meditate. You're making progress. Because the very first sign of progress is simply noticing how chaotic and out of control our mind really is. if we've never sat down to meditate and focus on an object like the breath, we may have this illusion. My mind is okay, you know, focusing on the breath, well, that can't be too difficult. I might get a bit distracted, but I should be able to do that okay. And then when we find we can't hardly focus more than a couple of seconds, that's the result. So therefore, if that's your experience, very good. You're making progress. You've made to the first stage. Now, the type of mental engagement here is what's called focused, meaning we need to put a lot of effort to simply focus on the object. So that's what focused engagement means. We have to put a lot of effort just even to focus for a short time. The quality of our experience is movement, meaning a lot of things going on in our mind, a lot of distractions. And so the thoughts in our mind, again, like a waterfall of thoughts crashing down on our mind. So that's the first stage of practice. If we continue to practice, we go around the bend to the next straight road, and that is the second stage called continuous attention. And so what we notice here is that the elephant and monkey are not running so fast anymore. There's a little bit of white on the top of the head of the elephant. And so here we see writing regarding that. So again, if we go to the black and white diagram, the translation of what it says about that is, it says here, from here, the black color progressively becomes white. This symbolizes the factor of vividness or clarity and the factor of stability progressively increasing, meaning our stability and clarity are getting a bit better. So what we achieve at the second stage is we have some attentional continuity on the object, meaning we can hold the object, in our case here, the breath, for up to a minute or two. And we do this, the power by which we achieve the second stage is reflection, or thinking about the practice, meaning reflecting on the practice, understanding the practice better, being more enthusiastic about the practice. Therefore, putting more effort into practice, we can get to stage 2. What problems persist is that most of the time the attention is not on the object. So we're still distracted for long periods of time. So therefore, the main imbalance again is coarse excitation, where we're still distracted for quite long periods of time. And again, the mental engagement is focused, meaning we still need to put a lot of effort simply just to keep focusing on the object, because we're distracted most of the time. So the quality of our experience, again, is one of a lot of movement in our mind. Again, thoughts like a cascading waterfall crashing down in our mind. But if we keep practicing, we go around the next bend to the third and fourth stage. And the third stage here is called resurgent attention. So what we see here, and this road here is the road of mindfulness. So we achieve this third and fourth stage by the power of our mindfulness, meaning our mindfulness is getting a lot better. So we now see at stage 3 and 4, the rope of mindfulness is now really tied to the elephant of the mind. So what we achieve at the third stage is that now when we get distracted from the object, we quickly recognize that and quickly come back to the object. And that's symbolized by the elephant turning the head backwards, that we quickly recognize distraction and quickly come back to the object. What problems persist is that one still forgets the object entirely for brief periods. So we still do get distracted from the object for brief periods of time. So therefore the imbalance here is still coarse excitation, where we do get completely distracted, but only for brief periods of time. But now the type of mental engagement is not focused, it's interrupted, because now we're mainly on the object, and every now and again we're interrupted by laxity and excitation. So therefore it's called interrupted engagement on the object. Qualitative experience, still a lot of movement, a lot of things going on in our mind, still like a cascading waterfall of thoughts crashing down on our mind. And the other thing we notice here at the third stage is the rabbit has come into the picture. And the rabbit here is symbolizing subtle laxity. So here from the third stage, we need to be able to distinguish this subtle laxity, because if we don't, we'll get stuck here. Because by the third stage, we're focusing on the object quite well. If we get distracted, we quickly come back to the object. So we may have this illusion that actually, I think I'm pretty close to shamatha already. But what's happening is, of course, even though where stability is very good, clarity is really missing. That we need to still do a lot of work on improving clarity of attention. So we need to pick up this subtle laxity where the mind is sinking a little bit. We're focused quite well on the object. It's fairly clear, but it's not sharp. And so we need to pick that up. If we don't, we'll get stuck here. And then we go to the fourth, close attention. And so here now mindfulness is getting very good. So what we achieve at the fourth stage is now we can hold the object the entire session without ever completely losing it. And we achieve that, of course, by the power of mindfulness. Now, what problems persist is there's some degree of complacency regarding our practice, regarding samadhi or concentration practice, because now we can hold the object the entire session we never lose it completely. And so we can get a bit complacent thinking, well, I think I'm just about finished the shamatha practice. I'm pretty close. And so we get a bit complacent about the practice. Now the imbalances are coarse laxity. So we still have quite a lot of sinking, but now we don't have coarse excitation. We never get completely distracted. We have what's called medium excitation. Medium excitation, remember we saw, was that when we start to get distracted, we're still focusing a little bit on the object, let's say the breath, but most of our mind is occupied by some sort of distraction, but we never completely lose the object. So that's medium excitation. So we saw that in the description there, that involuntary thoughts occupy the center of attention while the meditative object is displaced to the periphery. So you may have noticed that in your focusing on the breath, you think, oh, I can focus on the breath and think about dinner at the same time. Well, we can't focus on two things at once, simultaneously, impossible. It seems like that, but what's happening, of course, is over a very brief period of time, we are shifting backwards and forwards between the breath and thinking about dinner, backwards and forwards. So our attention is very much fragmented. And here at stage 4, it can be fragmented to the point where most of our attention is on thinking about something else and only a little bit is still on the object, in this case, the breath. So we still have a lot of work to do on improving the quality of our attention in less fragmentation and improving the clarity of attention as well. And that's what we're going to be looking at in the higher stages in the next session. So just to finish stage 4 here, so mental engagement is interrupted. So we're still interrupted by degrees of laxity and excitation. The quality of our experience now is one of achievement. Now we really have a sense that we're not really a beginner in the shamatha practice anymore, but now we're really getting somewhere in the shamatha practice. And our mind is starting to calm down a little bit. So instead of a waterfall of thoughts crashing down, it's more like a fast flowing river of thoughts. So that's the 4th stage. And so here we have those 3 levels of laxity and excitation. And so what we're going to see in the next session, where we look at stages 5 to 9, is that we start to refine. So we're really working on the first 4 levels, just these coarse levels of both. Whereas over the middling and higher stages, we are dealing with more and more subtle levels and correcting more and more subtle levels of excitation and laxity. And we'll talk about that in the next session. So that brings us to the actual practice in this session now. And we're going to move now to the second variation of mindfulness of breathing, that is to focus on the abdomen. So that's a fairly large area of focus. So this is particularly good for improving stability of attention. So what is the object that we're focusing on here is the tactile sensations of the rising and lowering of the abdomen as you breathe. Again, using that bare attention. So we're not imagining the movement of the abdomen. We're not visualizing the abdomen. We're focusing on the actual sensations of the rising and lowering of the abdomen as you breathe. The balance here is we're balancing, we're enhancing stability of attention with this, without losing relaxation. So we're balancing with relaxation, making sure we keep that basis in relaxation. And again, if we find these two imbalances of laxity and excitation, then appropriately using the relax, release, return, refresh, restore, retain to correct those. One other thing we're going to bring into the meditation is to help improve stability of attention. Partway through the meditation, we're going to introduce counting the breath. Now, counting the breath is not part of the standard practice. We are adding something, but it could be a useful short-term strategy to enhance stability of attention. Now, counting the breath has a cost benefit to it. The cost of counting is we're adding conceptual activity. The benefit is that by engaging our mind in counting the breath, that leaves less opportunity for it to get caught up in other distractions. So that's the benefit. There are many ways of counting the breath. Some traditions simply keep counting, some get very elaborate. What we're going to do in this session is we're going to count from 1 up to 10 and then go back to 1. So we're going to repeat that. And we're going to count at the end of the in-breath. You could count at the end of the out-breath as well, but for this session, we'll count at the end of the in-breath. And if you lose the count at any stage, go back to 1. So that is and we're going to bring that in just to see if it helps to stabilize attention. Some people find counting breath very helpful. Other people find it not so useful. But let's experiment with that now in this session and see if it does help us to improve attention or stability of our attention. And we'll bring it in sort of partway through the meditation. So let's do that practice now. Finding a nice comfortable posture, let's begin. Allowing your awareness to descend into the body and simply becoming aware of sensations throughout the body. And using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And so in this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And keeping the body as still as possible, avoiding any unnecessary movement. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. and setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Not dwelling in the past, not anticipating the future. In particular, letting go of any expectations for this meditation. Letting go of all of these things. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. And just rest there. And from that stillness, now direct your attention to the area of your abdomen and focus on the sensations of the rising and lowering of the abdomen as you breathe. Maintaining an ongoing flow of mindfulness of the sensations of the breath throughout the entire cycle of each in and out breath. If you get distracted from the breath, no need to get frustrated or upset. In fact, be happy you've noticed you've become distracted. And then the first thing to do is simply relax. Then release the distraction and very gently return to the breath. So relax, release, and return. Simply keep coming back to the breath again and again, each time you get distracted. Let's now introduce counting the breath to see if it helps to improve the stability of our attention. So at the end of the in-breath, mentally count 1, and then focus on the sensations of the breath on the following out-breath, and then the following in-breath. At the end of the next in-breath, mentally count 2. In this way, counting from 1 up to 10, and go back to 1. If you lose count at any time, simply go back to 1. So let's experiment now with counting the breath to see if it helps to improve the stability of our attention. And we can bring the meditation to a close. So we have some time for Q&A now. So have we got any questions, Miffy?
Not yet, but give
Not yet. Oof.
people a moment to get out of their abdomens and into their fingertips.
Too much focused on the abdomen to write any questions.
Is it significant where you actually count each breath? Like you were saying, you know, at the end of the in breath?
Yeah.
Does it make any difference?
Yeah. Okay. The counting the breath, well, first is counting the breath is not part of the standard practice. So the cost is you're adding some conceptual activity. So that's the cost, which means that if you count the breath, once you get deeper into the practice, that counting becomes another distraction or obstacle. But in the short term, if you're heavily distracted, then occupying the mind by counting the breath a little bit can help avoid heavy distraction. So the benefit is in the short term, it could help avoid other distractions. But not everyone finds it useful. Some people find it very useful, some people not so useful. So what I would recommend generally with counting the breath is only bring it in when you need it, and only if you find it helpful. Now, in terms of the methods of counting, as I briefly mentioned, there are a number of methods of counting the breath. The one we did was counting one for every cycle of in and out breath. So sometimes people count more, so they count one on the in, two on the out, three on the in, you know, the counting. But I think that's can be a little bit too much counting. Or sometimes people count like every second or third breath, they count that as one. So you can count more or less. You can count from 1 up to 10. You can keep counting. You can go backwards. You can do all sorts of things. What I find is that counting at the end of the out breath tend to sort of like expel the air too quickly, somehow like. Whereas if you're counting at the end of the in breath, I find that it works better together with the actual breathing. Whereas I find that if you're counting, I find that counting at the end of the out breath, it somehow it interferes with the breathing a little bit more, I find. But it's just personal preference. There's no thing that says you have to do it a certain way. One other point that is very important with this is it's not mindfulness of counting. So we're not changing from the breath to counting as the object. So the idea is that you only very briefly mentally count. So let's say you're doing it at the end of the in-breath. So you very briefly mentally count 1, and then for the whole rest of the out-breath and following in-breath, you're focusing on the sensations. You're not just letting go of that and just doing mindfulness of counting. So that's something to bear in mind. So that's the sort of the recommendation for counting of the breath.
Yeah, so Pearlie said it definitely helped with the waterfall kind of experience of the mind for her. Andrew found that counting the breathing seemed to make it more forced or controlled.
Yeah, so this is the thing is that, and some people may have found that with the rhythm of the breath as well, is that generally, particularly in our modern society, we like to, you know, control things. And definitely the breath is definitely something we have some control over. So we have this tendency, there can be this even strong tendency to try somehow to control the breath, because we have a habit of controlling things that we can control. So when we're paying close attention to the breath, there can be this strong habit of trying to control the breath. And so the thing to do there, of course, is to notice it first, of course, and then just let it go, let it go, let it go, let it go. Just keep letting go that the wanting to control the breath. So it's just a habit we have to get out of if we are in that habit of trying to control the breath. And remember, in this shamatha practice, we're not trying, it's not better to have our breath shallow or short or rhythmic or whatever. And that's what often people do. People feel like if I'm to meditate well, I have to make my breathing more subtle. And so people sort of unnaturally force their breath more subtle because they think that's what they should be doing. And then what happens is at some point they go, because they're not breathing enough. So that's a sure sign that you're controlling the breath. So just let that go altogether, because the body knows how much it needs to breathe. So just let the body do whatever it needs to do.
Glenn, I'm really glad you said about not taking counting as the object of mindfulness, because clearly I've been distracted in that way, and it can become like a counting compulsion as well.
Sure, but I mean, at least that's one step better than thinking about dinner for the whole meditation. No, at least you're focusing on something relative. But even better would be, of course, is to just briefly introduce that, and for the rest of the breath, focus on the breath.
And so is that count then a little bit like using the introspection to make sure that you're kind of still there?
Well, it's just not exactly, because the counting is just occupying the mind. So we're occupying the mind with something relating to the practice. Whereas if we don't occupy the mind goes, oh, I need to think, I got to think about something else. And so the mind goes all over the place. Whereas if you occupy the mind, and particularly in terms of counting, you have to remember where you are. So you have to sort of pay attention. So that can be helpful. Some traditions, instead of counting the breath, they talk about noting the breath. So, you know, they say like mentally note breathing in, breathing out, or simply in, out, in, out. So like that. So that's also possible. But again, what I'd recommend is don't overuse it. But if you find it helpful in the short term, bring it in and use it when necessary. But you will find that the deeper you go into the practice, at some point at the beginning, it might be a good benefit to stabilize, but you will find as you go deeper in the practice, it'll just become another distraction, and you'll need to let go of it altogether to go further into the practice.
Then Carolyn asked, when considering the abdomen as the object, is it the whole area or a smaller area?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, the abdomen here, the emphasis on stability. So I wouldn't, I mean, whatever works best for you is the answer. But what I wouldn't do is at least initially make it too small, because what you'll find is if you make it a very small area, you may find it difficult to focus there, and you're probably going to tighten. So again, just personal preference, but just be wary of, if you do bring it down to a smaller area, not to then tighten, because it's more difficult to focus on. That's one of the things we're going to look at when we look at the nostrils, this sort of tendency to tighten because it's a smaller object.
Then Deepa has a question. Glenn, I know you said we can't be focused on two things at once, but can we still focus on our breath but be aware of our thoughts, or are we just quickly jumping between the two?
Correct. We're jumping between the two. And that's what sometimes people feel like, oh, I'm focusing on the breath. Oh, okay, I'm thinking about dinner at the same time, but I'm on the breath. Well, not really. Again, what's happening is over a very short a period of time, maybe a couple of seconds, we are switching backwards and forwards very quickly between two objects, which gives the illusion that we're focusing on two things simultaneously. But what's actually happening is our attention is completely fragmented, which means we're not paying attention well to either of those two things we're focusing on. So that's something we need to work on. And that's what we do work on the middling stages, that even in the middling stages, our attention is fragmented. And we're trying to less and less fragmenting and more time continuously on the object, in this case, the breath.
And then with the counting or noting the breath, how do we know when it's time to kind of not do that anymore, when to let that one go?
Yeah. Again, I wouldn't bring it in as the standard, because then we can get a bit lazy. So I certainly would only bring it in when we have quite a lot of distraction. And so then you will notice there will be a point where it doesn't seem to be doing much for you. In fact, you may start to get a little bit annoyed by it. And so if that's the case, then that's probably a sign that it's starting instead of being a benefit, it's now starting to be a bit of an obstacle.
Oh, then there's a couple of other kind of related questions. So again, from Deepa, it seems like their thoughts there are always. So then if we're focused on the breath, are we not just aware of the thoughts?
Yeah, so this is something that we'll address a little bit when we continue this chart in the next session. And again, it's what you'll find is that the better you're focusing on the breath, the less you're going to notice those thoughts. I mean, now we notice them a lot, means we not only notice them, we grab hold of them and off we go on some story. But as we move along the shamatha path, we'll notice them less and less. And actually, as we saw in that 4-stage model for shamatha, actually at the higher levels of shamatha, the mind will go completely still.
Okay, and then again, back to the abdomen. So in this case, is the breath the object that we're observing the sensation, or is the abdomen the object?
Well, it's the sensations of the rising and lowering of the abdomen as you breathe.
Okay. Right, that's it for questions.
Well, I think it's actually we're right on 8:30, so we're perfectly timed. So then let's leave it there. So again, let's just spend a moment to dedicate all of our efforts in this evening's session before we rush off. So again, we can do that in our own way based on the earlier motivation which we set. And so then the next session, of course, is next Tuesday, session 5. We're going to continue with this practice of mindfulness of breathing, focusing in the area of the abdomen, a variation that's emphasized in a number of particularly the Theravada Buddhist traditions. And also in that session, we'll continue our discussion on this 9 stages to shamatha. So if you'd like to prepare a little bit by having a look at the chart and the diagram there, that might be helpful as well before next Tuesday. So then until next Tuesday, stay safe, stay well, have a nice weekend. We'll see you next Tuesday evening. So thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.